world moves slower. Not better. Not worse. Just slower. You remember it. The sound of a modem connecting, the weight of a phone receiver in your hand, the quiet space between moments. Childhood was not documented. It simply happened, and when it passed, it stayed in memory, unrecorded, imperfect, human. You are part of a generation that grew up before the world was redesigned. You played outside until the sky turned orange. You memorized phone numbers because you had to. If you missed a television show, it disappeared forever. If you made a mistake, it faded with time. There was no archive waiting to remind you of who you used to be. Then something shifted. The internet arrived not as a background tool, but as a tidal wave. You were old enough to remember life before it, yet young enough to adapt when it came. Now you built your identity in analog, but constructed your adulthood in digital. And just when you were beginning to find your footing, the ground gave way. You entered the workforce, or were just establishing yourself when the financial system cracked. Stability evaporated. Plans dissolved. Promotions disappeared. For many of you, the promise of a linear life, study, work, progress, was replaced by uncertainty. And uncertainty leaves marks. But here is what no one told you. You were being trained by waiting, trained by silence, trained by instability, trained by reinvention. You're often described as in between, too young to be traditional, too old to be native to the digital world. Not fully Gen X, not fully millennial, a foot in both eras, belonging nowhere completely. But what if being in between was never a weakness? What if it was positioning? You are the Hinge Generation. A hinge is not the door. It is not the wall. It does not demand attention, but without it, nothing moves smoothly. It absorbs tension. It carries weight. It allows transition. You learned patience before speed became normal. You learned independence before supervision became constant. You learned caution before risk became gamified. You learned depth before distraction became default. That combination is rare. Today's world moves fast, faster than any generation before has experienced. Information is infinite. Attention is fragmented. Identity is curated. Everything is visible. Everything is permanent. And yet, anxiety has never been higher. You remember a time when boredom was survivable, when silence did not feel threatening, when being unreachable was normal, and when mistakes did not define you forever. That memory is not nostalgia. It is calibration, because you have something younger generations are still struggling to build, an internal reference point. You know what life feels like without constant stimulation. You know what it means to wait. You know what it means to rebuild. You survived a technological revolution. You survived a financial collapse. You survived the psychological, and you adapted. Quietly. Without branding it. Without announcing it. Without hashtags. This audiobook is not about longing for the past. It is about recognizing what that past built inside you. It built resilience. It built perspective. It built adaptability. It built restraint. You are not outdated. You are cross-trained by history. You know how to live without the internet. You know how to function inside it. You understand collapse. You understand recovery. You understand transition. And in unstable times, the people who understand transition are the most valuable people in the room. You are not lost between generations. You are the stabilizer in unstable eras. Over the next chapters, we will not romanticize the past. We will examine it. We will understand the psychological architecture it formed inside you. And we will uncover the strength that came from living through a world that would not stop changing. Because the truth is simple. You did not grow up in comfort. You grew up in transition, and transition creates strength. Welcome to the Hinge Generation. Chapter 1. The Sound of an Analog Childhood. Before the storm of notifications, There was quiet. Not empty quiet, not lonely quiet, but spacious quiet. Childhood in an analog world had texture. It had pauses. It had friction. You didn't move from one stimulation to the next in seamless digital flow. You waited. You searched. You wondered. And without realizing it, you were building something invisible. Think about the simple act of missing a phone call. The landline would ring. If you weren't there, it rang into silence. No instant callback notification, no red badge reminding you of what you missed. If you wanted to speak to someone, you had to try again. You had to be patient. You had to tolerate the gap between desire and fulfillment. That gap trained your nervous system. Today, discomfort lasts seconds before we anesthetize it with a scroll. But you grew up inside the gap. You felt boredom without immediately escaping it. You felt anticipation without checking an app. You felt uncertainty without tracking someone's location in real time. When you arranged to meet a friend, you showed up. There was no "Where are you?" text, no live updates. If they were late, you waited. And in that waiting, you learned something subtle but powerful. Life does not bend instantly to your preference. You adapted to reality instead of expecting reality to adapt to you. That is psychological strength. Boredom, especially, was a teacher most people today never meet. Long summer afternoons with nothing scheduled, car rides without screens, rainy days with no entertainment algorithm to rescue you. At first, boredom feels uncomfortable. The mind searches for stimulation. But if stimulation doesn't arrive, something else happens. Imagination wakes up. You created games out of nothing. You built worlds from cardboard boxes. You rode your bike simply because motion felt better than stagnation. Your brain learned to generate its own engagement rather than outsource it. That skill is rare now. When a mind constantly relies on external input, it weakens its internal creative muscle. But you developed that muscle early. You didn't need constant novelty to survive an afternoon. You could sit, you could think, you could wander. And wandering builds reflection. There was also a different relationship with time. You waited for photographs to be developed. You waited for your favorite show to air once a week. You waited for letters to arrive. Waiting was not an inconvenience. It was part of the process. In a strange way, anticipation made experiences heavier, more meaningful. When everything is instant, nothing feels earned. But when something requires time, it gains psychological weight. The effort of waiting deepens attachment. You learned that lesson without anyone teaching it explicitly. Even conflict felt different. If you argued with someone, you couldn't fire off a message at midnight. You had to sit with your emotions. Sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. That space created cooling time. It forced you to process before reacting. You are building emotional regulation. Today, impulsive reaction is rewarded by speed. But in your youth, reaction had friction, and friction slows down emotion enough for reflection to enter. You might not have realized it then. But every delay, every inconvenience, so every quiet stretch was strengthening your capacity to endure discomfort without collapsing. That capacity matters more now than ever, because the digital storm we live in removes friction. It removes waiting, it removes silence, but it also removes depth. And when depth disappears, anxiety rises. Why? Because a nervous system trained only for immediacy struggles when immediacy fails. You, however, were trained in delay. You experienced what it feels like when plans change and there is no instant constant reassurance. You navigated neighborhoods without GPS. You memorized directions, you got lost and figured it out. Getting lost is underrated. When you rely entirely on navigation systems, you lose spatial awareness. But when you wander and recalibrate, your mind develops resilience. It learns that confusion is temporary, that orientation can be rebuilt. That lesson extends beyond geography. In adulthood, when careers shift or relationships fracture, many people panic because they have no experience being disoriented. But you have been disoriented before. You have stood on a street corner unsure of direction and survived it. That memory sits quietly inside you. There was also less performance. Childhood mistakes were not documented. Awkward phases were not preserved in high resolution. You were allowed to evolve privately. Identity unfolded without an audience. That creates psychological elasticity. When a person grows without constant observation, they experiment more freely. They try, they fail, they adjust. They are not locked into a digital archive of past selves. You had room to become. In many ways, the analog world was not easier. It simply required more initiative. If you wanted information, you searched for it physically. If you wanted connection, you made effort. If you wanted entertainment, you created it. Effort builds competence, and competence builds quiet confidence. Not loud confidence, not curated confidence, but internal confidence, the kind that doesn't need immediate validation. When you look back, it may feel like nostalgia, but beneath the memory is architecture. Mental architecture formed by repetition. Wait, adapt, imagine, endure. You did not grow up optimized for speed. You grew up trained for patience. And patience is not weakness, it is power stretched across time. As the digital storm accelerated, many people were overwhelmed by its velocity, but you had something anchoring you. A memory of slower rhythms, a body that knew how to wait, a mind that knew how to generate engagement without constant input. That foundation matters now, because the world will continue to accelerate. Technology will continue to compress time. Attention will continue to fragment. But the ability to pause, to sit, to endure uncertainty without immediate escape, that ability is becoming rare, and you already have it. Silence was not empty. It was preparation. Waiting was not wasted. It was conditioning. Boredom was not a void. It was training. The analog childhood did not make you outdated. It made you durable. And durability in a digital storm is a quiet advantage few truly understand. Chapter 2. The Bilingual Brain. You did not grow up fully digital, and you did not grow up fully analog either. You grew up in the transition. That matters more than most people realize. There is a window in human development when the brain is especially adaptable. Neuroscience shows that the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for decision-making, impulse control, long-term planning, and emotional regulation, continues developing into the mid-20s. You were inside that window when the digital world exploded. That timing created something rare. You were not born into permanent connectivity. You remember life without it, but you were young enough when it arrived to absorb it naturally. You learned to email, to search, to text, to adapt, without feeling like technology was an invading force. You were not overwhelmed by it, so you integrated it. This created a kind of psychological bilingualism. Like someone who speaks two languages fluently, you can move between two mental worlds. You understand offline presence and online acceleration. You can sit through a long conversation without reaching for your phone, and you can navigate a new app without anxiety. That flexibility is cognitive strength. Digital natives often struggle with silence because silence feels unfamiliar. Digital immigrants often resist technology because it feels disruptive. But you are neither extreme. You are a translator. You understand what life feels like without constant input. That memory anchors you. And yet, you are not paralyzed by innovation. You adapt to new tools because adaptation has always been part of your story. This is not accidental. When a brain develops during stable conditions and then encounters rapid change, it learns pattern recognition. It learns comparison. It learns contrast. You can feel when something is too fast. You can sense when something is artificial. You can detect when convenience becomes dependency, because you have a reference point. Many people today have no baseline for comparison. If someone grows up in noise, noise feels normal. If someone grows up in speed, speed feels neutral. But you experienced both states. You know the difference between stimulation and meaning. That discernment is rare. There is also emotional intelligence embedded in this bilingual brain. You grew up making eye contact, reading facial expressions, interpreting tone without emojis. You learned to repair misunderstandings in person, not through threads of text. Later, you learned digital nuance. You learned professional email tone. You learned online etiquette. You learned how to navigate platforms without losing credibility. You built both skill sets, and building both created adaptability under pressure. When workplaces shifted online, you adjusted. When social norms evolved rapidly, you recalibrated. When communication styles changed, you translated between generations. That translation is leadership. Often, you do it quietly. You explain new technology to older relatives. You explain cultural references to younger colleagues. You sit between worlds and prevent miscommunication. You are the hinge in motion. But there is another layer to this bilingual mind. One that is psychological rather than technical. You learned skepticism early. The early internet was messy, chaotic, full of promise and misinformation at the same time. You saw it before algorithms became sophisticated. You experienced chat rooms, early forums, the wild openness of it. So you developed caution alongside curiosity. You don't believe everything online automatically. But you're not afraid of it either. You question, you verify, you observe. That balance between openness and doubt is a powerful cognitive filter. In an era where polarization spreads quickly, the ability to pause before reacting is essential. And your mind was shaped before reaction speed became cultural currency. You are not trained to respond instantly to every stimulus. You are trained to evaluate. Evaluation requires space. And space is something your generation understands instinctively. Like another advantage of growing through the transition is your relationship with identity. Digital natives often build identity publicly from the beginning. Profiles, posts, permanent timelines. But you built your early identity privately. You experimented offline. You changed interests without broadcasting them. When social media emerged, you were internal stability. Your identity was not entirely dependent on digital affirmation. That separation creates resilience. When algorithms change, you do not collapse. When platforms shift, you do not disappear. When trends move on, you are not erased. Because your core was not built there. You are digitally fluent, but not digitally rooted. That distinction is important. Rooted identity bends less under online pressure. It absorbs feedback without being defined by it. There is also a neurological calmness that comes from remembering slower times. The brain that has experienced multiple environments becomes more adaptable under stress. It does not interpret change as catastrophe. It interprets change as pattern. You have lived through floppy disks and cloud storage, pages and smartphones, encyclopedias and search engines, physical maps and GPS. Each transition required small recalibrations. Each recalibration strengthened neural flexibility. Flexibility is a survival trait. Rigid systems break under pressure. Flexible systems absorb shock. When industries shift now, you may feel discomfort, but not paralysis. You have internal evidence that change, while disruptive, is survivable. That evidence lowers fear, and lower fear increases clarity. Self-mastery begins with clarity. If your nervous system is constantly overwhelmed, you react. But if it has learned to observe change over time, you respond strategically. Your bilingual brain allows you to zoom out. You can remember a time before the current trend. That memory alone reduces urgency. It reminds you that what feels permanent today may be temporary tomorrow. That perspective is grounding. It allows you to make long-term decisions in short-term chaos. And perhaps the greatest strength of your bilingual brain is this: you are not addicted to one world. You can disconnect without existential crisis. You can reconnect without intimidation. You can adapt tools without worshipping them. Technology, for you, is utility, not identity. And that separation creates freedom. Freedom to choose how you engage. Freedom to step back. Freedom to evaluate before absorbing. You are not stuck between generations. You are cognitively cross-trained. You carry the memory of slowness and the skill of speed. You carry skepticism and curiosity. You carry independence and collaboration. That combination is not confusion, it is capacity. The storm continues to evolve. Platforms will change, tools will accelerate, culture will mutate. But you have already proven something important. You can learn without losing yourself. You can adapt without dissolving. You can upgrade without abandoning your foundation. That is not accidental. It is neurological positioning. You are not overwhelmed by change. You were shaped by it. And in a world that keeps reinventing itself, the bilingual mind is not behind. It is ahead. Chapter 3. The Scar of 2008. There is a specific kind of silence that follows collapse. Not the quiet of childhood, not the spacious quiet of waiting, but the heavy quiet of uncertainty. For many in your generation, that silence arrived in 2008. You were not teenagers watching the news from a distance. You were entering adulthood, signing leases, starting careers, taking on debt, planning futures, and then the system cracked. Jobs disappeared. Companies froze hiring, promotions vanished. Retirement accounts evaporated. Homes lost value. The word stability suddenly felt fragile. You were told to work hard, study well, build responsibly, and you did. But effort did not guarantee protection. That realization changes a person. There is a psychological concept known as economic scarring. When individuals enter the workforce during a recession, the impact does not disappear when the economy recovers. Earnings may lag. Career trajectories shift. Risk tolerance changes. But beyond finances, something deeper happens. Trust shifts. Before 2008, there was still an underlying belief in structural predictability. Institutions, while imperfect, felt solid. After 2008, that solidity cracked. You learned something difficult early. Systems can fail. That lesson can create anxiety, but it can also create discernment. Some people respond to collapse with fear. Others respond with recklessness. But many in your generation developed something quieter. Strategic caution. You began saving differently. You evaluated job security differently. You questioned debt differently. You looked at markets with a skeptical eye. You were not pessimistic. You were calibrated. Calibration is different from fear. Fear says nothing is safe. Calibration says not everything is guaranteed. That subtle difference shapes long-term behavior. Entering adulthood during instability forced you to mature quickly. There was no prolonged innocence about economic reality. You saw layoffs. You saw friends move back home. You saw capable people struggle. You internalized contingency planning. Always have a backup. Always be ready to pivot. Always assume volatility is possible. That mindset can feel heavy. It can produce a low hum of vigilance. But it also produces preparedness. Prepared people do not panic as easily. When the pandemic disrupted economies years later, many younger generations experienced their first systemic shock. For you, it was not new territory. Unsettling, yes, but not unfamiliar. You had already lived through one major rupture. Your nervous system had data. It knew that shock eventually stabilizes, that chaos eventually reorganizes, that collapse, while painful, is survivable. Survivable. That word matters. Because surviving instability builds a different kind of confidence than succeeding during stability. If your success only exists in calm waters, you doubt yourself in storms. But if you have stayed afloat during turbulence, you carry proof inside your body. Proof reduces panic. 2008 also altered your relationship with ambition. Before collapse, ambition often meant upward movement, promotions, larger salaries, visible milestones. After collapse, ambition became more nuanced. Security mattered. Flexibility mattered. Skill diversification mattered. You began valuing resilience over prestige. That shift is profound. Prestige depends on external validation. Resilience depends on internal capacity. One can be taken away quickly. The other compounds over time. And there is another layer to the scar of 2008. Identity disruption. Early adulthood is when we form professional identity. We ask, who am I in the workforce? What is my trajectory? What is my worth? When that formation period coincides with economic instability, identity becomes intertwined with uncertainty. You may have questioned your choices, your degree, your path, your timing. Did I miss the window? Did I start too late? Will I ever catch up? These thoughts leave impressions, but impressions are not destiny. In many cases, starting in instability forces creative problem solving. You learn to freelance, to side hustle, to acquire adjacent skills, to move cities, to reinvent. Reinvention is uncomfortable, but repeated reinvention builds agility. Agile professionals survive long-term shifts better than rigid specialists. The world now changes faster than ever. Industries transform. Technology disrupts entire fields overnight. Those who expect permanence struggle. Those who expect evolution adjust. You expect evolution because permanence was shattered early for you. There is grief in that. You did not get a slow, predictable climb into adulthood. You got a test of endurance, but endurance builds emotional density. You do not romanticize markets. You do not worship institutions. You do not assume infinite stability. You plan. Planning is power. And there is one more quiet effect of 2008 that often goes unspoken. Empathy. When you have watched capable people lose jobs through no personal fault, you soften your judgments. You understand that effort and outcome are not always perfectly aligned. You become slower to label failure as weakness. That empathy makes you a steadier leader. You understand volatility, you understand fear, you understand rebuilding, and because you understand them, you respond differently. The scar of 2008 is not only financial, it is psychological. It shaped your relationship with risk. It shaped your relationship with security. It shaped your relationship with ambition. But here is the reframe. Scars are evidence of healing. A wound that never heals remains open. A scar indicates survival. You did not collapse when the system did. You adjusted. You recalibrated. You matured faster than planned, saying that maturity now functions as quiet strength. When markets fluctuate, you do not assume apocalypse. When headlines scream, you do not immediately react. When instability appears, you tighten structure rather than dissolve, because you have seen the sky darken before. And you remained standing. The scar of 2008 did not make you fragile. It made you realistic. It made you strategic. It made you aware that stability is not guaranteed. So capacity must be built internally. External systems may shake. Internal architecture can remain firm. You are not broken by the collapse. You are forged by it. And forged steel does not fear pressure. It understands it, it has survived it, and it carries that survival forward, quietly, steadily, into whatever storm comes next. Rat tot hier. Min tep tukvoy, chapter bon, jitheo, jung outline sao moi fut. Gyun hip tram, sao, kong lapika chung truok, jiao vao, quien juok lang quen, nhu mot loy, the tam li. Chapter 4. The Gift of Being Forgotten. There is a luxury your generation experienced that is nearly extinct today. The luxury of disappearing, not dramatically, not permanently, but quietly. You were allowed to make mistakes that dissolved. You were allowed to experiment without documentation. You were allowed to outgrow versions of yourself without an archive reminding the world who you used to be. That freedom shaped you more than you realize. In the analog world, identity evolved privately. Awkward phases were temporary. Embarrassing moments faded into selective memory. Stories were retold, reshaped, softened by time. Memory was fluid. Today, identity is recorded in high definition. Posts are time-stamped. Photos are stored indefinitely. Opinions can be resurfaced years later. Growth is frozen in digital permanence. But you developed before that permanence became normal, and that gave you psychological elasticity. Elasticity is the ability to stretch without snapping. When identity is constantly observed, people become cautious. They curate, they perform, they manage perception, they hesitate before experimenting because experimentation now carries a digital footprint. But you experimented before performance became public. You changed interests, you changed styles, you changed friend groups, you changed beliefs, and you did so without broadcasting every shift. That private evolution built internal security. You learned that identity is allowed to change, that who you are at 15 does not imprison who you become at 25. That who you were at 25 does not define you at 40. This flexibility reduces shame. When mistakes are not permanently displayed, so they are processed rather than defended, you were able to integrate lessons without constantly protecting a brand. Brand identity is rigid. Human identity is adaptive. You were shaped in the adaptive era. There is also something else: forgiveness. When memories are held primarily in human minds rather than servers, they soften. Stories are retold with humor. Failures become anecdotes. Immaturity becomes nostalgia. Digital permanence, however, keeps moments sharp. It resists softening. Because you were formed before this sharp permanence, you developed a healthier relationship with imperfection. You do not expect a flawless record. You understand that growth includes phases you would not repeat. That understanding makes you less fragile when confronted with criticism. If someone references your past mistakes, you're less destabilized, since you know you are not identical to your former self. You have already lived through transformation without public validation. That internal narrative, "I have evolved before and I can evolve again," is resilience. Another quiet advantage of being forgotten is psychological risk-taking. When actions are not permanently recorded, experimentation feels safer. You can try new skills, attempt creative projects, change careers, speak imperfectly, without the fear that missteps will follow you indefinitely. This fosters initiative. People who fear permanent embarrassment hesitate to begin, but you were trained in an era where embarrassment expired. Expiration creates courage, and courage compounds over time. There is also a deeper layer to privacy that often goes unnoticed. Environment. When you experienced something, you experienced it fully. There was no immediate impulse to document it. A concert was sound, not content. A gathering was presence, not potential post. You lived events without converting them into proof. That shapes memory differently. When experiences are lived rather than curated, they imprint internally. They become felt narratives instead of external artifacts. This strengthens internal referencing. Your self-concept is not entirely built on how moments were received. It is built on how moments were felt. That distinction reduces dependency on validation. You can enjoy without broadcasting. You can reflect without announcing. You can grow without narrating every step. That quiet growth builds depth. Depth requires privacy. Constant exposure flattens identity. It makes individuals performable, but not always grounded. You were grounded before exposure became default. That grounding allows you to step into digital spaces without being consumed by them. You can use platforms strategically rather than existentially. You know the world continues even when you log off. That knowledge lowers urgency. Lower urgency increases clarity, and clarity strengthens self-mastery. Another important psychological outcome of growing up without permanent documentation is narrative ownership. When memory lives in conversation, you shape it collaboratively. You retell stories, you reinterpret them, you extract meaning. Over time, your story evolves. Digital permanence limits reinterpretation. It preserves context in rigid form. But your early life was not rigidly preserved. You learned to reinterpret your own history. Reinterpretation is powerful. It allows you to extract wisdom from failure rather than freeze in shames. It allows you to see patterns rather than isolated mistakes. It allows you to say, that was a chapter, not a verdict. This mindset becomes crucial in adulthood. Careers shift, relationships change, roles evolve. If identity were fixed, each change would feel catastrophic. But because you grew up with fluid memory, you instinctively understand that life unfolds in chapters. Chapters close, new ones open. Being forgotten taught you that endings are survivable. There is something almost sacred about that. The ability to disappear for a while, to rebuild quietly, long to return without explanation. In a world that demands constant visibility, invisibility becomes strength. You do not fear stepping back. You do not equate silence with irrelevance. You know that depth grows underground. This is perhaps the greatest gift of being forgotten. You were allowed to become without constant witness. That allowed authenticity to form before performance. Now, when digital storms intensify, when reputations rise and fall rapidly, you remain steadier. Because your foundation was poured before the floodlights turned on. You are not defined by a feed. You are defined by lived experience. And lived experience, unlike digital record, evolves. The gift of being forgotten was not about hiding. It was about freedom. Freedom to change. Freedom to mature. Freedom to shed versions of yourself without public negotiation. That freedom built adaptability. And adaptability is your generation's signature strength. You are not shaped in a hall of mirrors. You are shaped in open space. And in open space, growth breathes. The world may now remember everything, but you remember what it feels like to grow without an audience. That memory keeps you human. It keeps you flexible. It keeps you from mistaking visibility for value. And in a digital storm obsessed with permanence, the ability to evolve quietly may be one of the most powerful forms of strength you possess. Chapter 5. Raised before constant supervision. There was a time when parents did not know exactly where you were, not because they did not care, but because they could not track you. No GPS, no live location sharing, no instant check-ins every 30 minutes. You left the house, and for hours at a time you existed in a world unsupervised. That absence of constant oversight did something important. It forced you to regulate yourself. You navigated neighborhoods without digital maps. You judged risk without algorithmic warnings. You negotiated conflicts with peers without adult intervention hovering nearby. Freedom and responsibility arrived together. When no one is watching, two things can happen. A person can drift toward recklessness, or a person can begin building internal authority. Most of the time, you built authority. You learned to measure consequences. You learned that small decisions ripple outward. You learned how to repair situations without immediately escalating them to someone older and more powerful. That builds competence. Competence builds confidence, and confidence built internally is different from confidence granted externally. Today, supervision is constant. Notifications remind parents. Cameras monitor classrooms. Text threads connect families instantly. Support is available at all times. Support is not wrong, but uninterrupted support can weaken autonomy. Autonomy develops in gaps. When a child solves a problem without immediate rescue, the nervous system registers, "I handled that." That registration compounds. Over time, it forms a baseline belief. "I can manage." You accumulated those registrations. You fixed your own mistakes. You navigated disagreements. You figured out transportation. You managed boredom. You encountered minor danger and recalibrated. None of it felt heroic. It felt normal. But normal exposure to small uncertainty builds tolerance for larger uncertainty later. If every discomfort is immediately removed, the threshold for distress lowers. But if discomfort is encountered repeatedly and survived, the threshold rises. Your threshold is higher than you think. You're less easily destabilized by inconvenience, less rattled by minor setbacks, less dependent on constant reassurance. That resilience was not taught explicitly. It was embedded in the structure of your childhood. There were no constant performance reports sent to your parents. No real-time academic dashboards, no digital archive of behavior analytics. You were trusted. Needing trust shapes identity. When a young person is trusted to manage their own time, their own conflicts, their own small risks, they internalize responsibility. They begin to see themselves as agents rather than subjects. Agency is power. Agency is the belief that your choices influence your outcomes. You grew up with that belief quietly forming in the background. When something went wrong, there was no immediate adult mediator available. You negotiated, you compromised, you sometimes failed publicly, and then you tried again. Failure without rescue builds durability. Panic narrows thinking. Durability expands it. In adulthood, when career paths twist unexpectedly or relationships shift suddenly, many people freeze because they have not built tolerance for unsupervised uncertainty. You have. So you have experienced being out there without a safety net and returning home intact. That memory lives in your body. There is also something else that constant supervision prevents. Solitude. You experienced solitude naturally. Long walks, quiet rooms, unstructured afternoons, bored bus rides. You were alone with your thoughts more often than today's children are. Solitude builds introspection. Introspection builds self-knowledge. Self-knowledge builds stability. When a person never sits alone long enough to hear their own thinking, they become externally driven. They react to input rather than generate insight, but you learn to generate your own insight. You thought about things without Googling them instantly. You processed emotions without immediately crowdsourcing opinions. You made decisions without polling an audience. That independence of thought is becoming rare. And rare skills gain value over time. There is also a physical dimension to this independence. You moved your body freely. You explored terrain. You got minor injuries. You tested physical boundaries. You developed spatial awareness. Physical independence reinforces psychological independence. When you know how to navigate space, you feel more capable navigating life. When you have fallen and gotten back up physically, you trust your capacity to recover emotionally. The body and mind learn in parallel. Growing up before constant supervision meant you developed micro-courage repeatedly. Crossing streets, meeting new people, trying unfamiliar activities. admitting mistakes without a digital filter. Each micro-courage strengthens the macro ability to face bigger challenges later. This is why many in your generation handle responsibility with steadiness. You are used to carrying weight, not because you are overburdened, but because you are not constantly shielded. Shielding reduces exposure. Exposure builds capacity, and capacity is what self-mastery depends on. Self-mastery is not about dominating circumstances. It is about regulating yourself within them. You regulate because you had to. You could not outsource every discomfort. You learn to calm yourself after embarrassment, to redirect yourself after distraction, to entertain yourself without constant novelty. That is emotional self-reliance. But emotional self-reliance is different from emotional isolation. You still valued connection, you still sought support, but you did not assume immediate rescue as default. That difference matters. In a digital storm where feedback is instant and support is always one message away, the ability to stand alone, even briefly, becomes a stabilizing force. You can disconnect without feeling abandoned. You can face conflict without immediate backup. You can make decisions without needing continuous validation. That internal grounding is not loud, but it is strong. And perhaps most importantly, growing up before constant supervision taught you consequences in real time. If you were late, you saw disappointment. If you broke something, you fixed it. If you hurt someone, you faced them directly. Direct consequences create clear learning loops. When consequences are delayed, abstracted, or mediated by screens, lessons can blur, but you experienced them face to face. That clarity shaped your ethics. You understand accountability not as punishment, but as reality. Reality-based learning builds maturity. Maturity reduces fragility. You may not always see this strength in yourself because it was built gradually. But look at how you respond under pressure. You do not immediately collapse. You evaluate, you prioritize, you adjust. That pattern began long before adulthood. It began when you were a child, walking home alone. It began when you solved a problem without announcing it. It began when you learned to self-correct without an audience. You were not micromanaged into strength, you were trusted into it, and trust, when met with responsibility, becomes character. The world now operates under constant visibility, continuous oversight, immediate commentary. But you were shaped in open air. That open air taught you how to breathe without instruction. It taught you how to stand without applause. It taught you how to recover without documentation. You were raised before constant supervision, and because of that, you learned something essential. You can handle more than you think. Not because you are invincible, but because you have done it before. Quietly, steadily, without needing the world to watch. Chapter 6. Living between skepticism and optimism. To stand between two worlds is uncomfortable, but it is also powerful. You are old enough to remember cynicism, the quiet distrust of institutions, the subtle sarcasm that shaped late 90s culture, the understanding that not everything presented as truth deserved belief. And yet, you are also young enough to have felt the early optimism of the internet, the belief that connection could expand, that opportunity could multiply, that collaboration across distance was possible. You inherited both, skepticism and optimism. Many generations lean heavily toward one side. Too much skepticism becomes paralysis. Too much optimism becomes naivete. But living between forces you to balance. You question, but you do not disengage. You hope, but you verify. That balance is you hope, but you verify. That balance is cognitive maturity. And skepticism protects you from blind trust. It sharpens analysis. It prevents impulsive allegiance. After witnessing economic collapse, technological hype cycles, and institutional failures, you learn to pause before committing fully. But optimism prevents you from withdrawing completely. You still believe improvement is possible. You still experiment with new tools. You still adapt rather than retreat. This duality creates perspective. Perspective widens thinking. When a new trend appears, you do not immediately worship it, but you also do not immediately reject it. You observe, you test, you adjust. That observational stance is strategic. In volatile environments, extreme reactions dominate. Outrage spreads quickly, blind enthusiasm spreads quickly, but measured response builds sustainable advantage. You're comfortable in the gray areas. You do not need everything to be categorized instantly. You can hold conflicting ideas without collapsing into identity crisis. That psychological flexibility reduces internal tension. Because you have lived through multiple shifts, you understand that narratives evolve. What seems permanent today may be revised tomorrow. This awareness tempers urgency. Urgency often leads to overreaction. Temperance leads to steadiness. Steadiness creates influence. There is also an emotional layer to standing between skepticism and optimism. You have seen promises fail, but you have also seen systems rebuild. You have experienced disappointment, but you have also experienced reinvention. This prevents both blind faith and chronic despair. You know the world can fracture, but you also know it can stabilize. And that lived evidence moderates emotional swings. Emotional moderation is strength in leadership. When teams panic, the person who has historical memory remains grounded. When people rush toward untested enthusiasm, the one who has seen cycles repeat introduces caution. You may not always recognize this in yourself, but others often feel it around you. You do not escalate easily. You do not collapse easily. You calibrate. Calibration requires both skepticism and optimism operating simultaneously. Too much skepticism says, "This will fail." Too much optimism says, "This cannot fail." Calibration says, "This may work, but let's prepare for risk." That middle ground is rarely glamorous, but it is sustainable. Living between also sharpens empathy. You understand older generations because you remember their pace. You understand younger generations because you adapted to their speed. You can translate across assumptions. When someone older resists change, you understand their discomfort. When someone younger embraces acceleration, you understand their excitement. That translation reduces friction, and friction reduction is influence. Influence is not about dominance. It is about understanding multiple perspectives and bridging them. You are wired for bridging, but there is a psychological cost to standing between. Sometimes you feel invisible, not fully claimed by either side. Too analog for digital natives, too digital for traditionalists. That in-between identity can feel isolating. Yet, isolation often hides strategic positioning. A hinge is not the door. It is not the wall. It is the mechanism that allows movement between them. Since you operate as mechanism more than monument. Monuments are visible. Mechanisms are functional. And function sustains systems. There is also an internal steadiness that comes from not over-identifying with extremes. When your identity is built entirely around one worldview, challenges to that worldview feel existential. But because you contain dual perspectives, disagreement does not destabilize you as easily. You can update your thinking without feeling erased. That is intellectual humility. Intellectual humility increases learning speed. Learning speed increases adaptability. Adaptability is survival. Standing between skepticism and optimism also affects how you approach risk. You are less likely to gamble blindly, but you are also less likely to freeze completely. You analyze, you plan, you move deliberately. Deliberate movement compounds. In financial decisions, career shifts, or personal relationships, you rarely operate on pure impulse. You have seen consequences unfold over time. That memory tempers emotion. This is not cynicism. It is seasoned awareness. Seasoned awareness often gets mislabeled as guardedness, but guardedness built from experience is wisdom, and wisdom reduces avoidable pain. The digital storm rewards extremes. Loud certainty spreads quickly, but certainty without nuance collapses under pressure. You are nuanced. Nuance is quiet strength. It allows you to adapt mid-course without shame. It allows you to revise without feeling weak. And it allows you to admit uncertainty without surrendering authority. Many people fear uncertainty because they have not practiced holding two truths at once. You have. You can believe technology expands opportunity and still believe it fragments attention. You can value independence and still value collaboration. You can respect tradition and still innovate. Holding these tensions without tearing apart internally is psychological integration. Integration creates coherence. Coherent individuals navigate complexity better than rigid ones, and complexity is the defining feature of your era. You are not confused because you stand between. You are comprehensive. You have seen multiple sides of transformation. You have lived in both quiet and chaos. You have experienced both stability and collapse. That breadth widens your lens. When challenges arise now, you do not reduce them to simple answers. You understand that reality is layered. Layered thinking leads to better decisions. Better decisions compound into stability, and stability in a volatile world becomes rare capital. Living between skepticism and optimism is not a flaw in your generation. It is its strategic edge. You question without disengaging. You hope without surrendering discernment. You adapt without abandoning foundation. That balance is not accidental. It was forged by living through contrast. And contrast builds clarity. You are not torn between worlds. You are trained by both. And in a digital storm that pulls people toward extremes, the one who stands steady in the middle often becomes the quiet center others gravitate toward. That center may not shout, but it holds. But it holds. Chapter 7. The Cost of Convenience. Convenience feels like progress, and in many ways, it is. You can order food in minutes, access information instantly, communicate across continents without delay, work from anywhere, learn almost anything on demand. But convenience is never free. It always asks for something in return. Your generation understands this more than most, because you remember what life felt like before friction was removed. Friction used to be normal. You waited in lines, you searched through books, you rewound tapes, you drove to stores, you navigated using printed directions. You experienced minor inconvenience daily, and that inconvenience shaped you. It built patience, it built attention span, it built tolerance for delay. Today, friction is treated as error. If something buffers for 5 seconds, irritation rises. And if delivery takes days instead of hours, frustration builds. If a response is delayed, anxiety creeps in. Convenience shortens tolerance. When everything becomes immediate, the nervous system recalibrates. It expects speed, it expects resolution, it expects stimulation, and when stimulation drops, restlessness appears. You, however, have lived in two rhythms. You know what it feels like to wait a week for an episode, to save money before purchasing, to call someone and hope they are home. Because of that memory, you possess a comparative awareness. You can feel when speed becomes overwhelming. You can sense when attention is fragmenting. Attention is the hidden cost of convenience. When access is unlimited, focus becomes scarce. Every notification competes. Every update interrupts. Every algorithm pull. If you were raised entirely inside this system, you might not notice the shift, but you remember extended concentration. You remember reading without distraction. You remember conversations uninterrupted by buzzing devices. That memory reveals contrast. Contrast reveals loss. The loss is not just patience, it is depth. Depth requires sustained attention. Sustained attention requires resistance to distraction, and distraction multiplies in frictionless systems. Convenience reduces friction, but friction often creates value. When something requires effort, you commit more fully. When something takes time, you invest more meaning. When something demands focus, you build cognitive strength. The digital storm removes these demands. Everything is easier. But easier does not always mean stronger. Your generation stands at an interesting intersection. You appreciate convenience, you use it, you benefit from it. But you also sense its psychological price. You feel the pull of endless scrolling. You notice the shortening of conversations. You observe how quickly outrage spreads. Because you remember slower cycles, the acceleration feels tangible. That awareness can either create frustration or discipline. Self-mastery in the age of convenience is not about rejecting technology. It is about governing your relationship with it. You are uniquely positioned for this governance. You have lived without instant access. You know it is survivable. You know that missing updates does not equal disappearance. You know that silence is not dangerous. That knowledge allows you to step back intentionally, to pause notifications, and to schedule offline hours, to read deeply, to think without interruption. These acts are small but powerful. They reintroduce friction, and friction strengthens mental muscle. The cost of convenience also appears in emotional regulation. When discomfort arises today, escape is immediate. You can scroll, stream, shop, message, distract within seconds. But distraction delays processing. Processing requires staying with discomfort long enough to understand it. You are trained in childhood to sit with boredom. That training extends to emotional states. You are more capable of tolerating temporary discomfort without immediate anesthesia. That tolerance prevents impulsive decisions. Impulsive decisions often compound regret. Regret drains stability. Stability builds strength. Convenience also alters perception of time. As when everything moves fast, days blur, weeks compress, years accelerate. The constant flow of information fragments narrative coherence. But because you remember slower pacing, you're capable of creating intentional slowness. You can choose long projects. You can engage in sustained skill development. You can resist the urge for instant mastery. That resistance builds excellence. Excellence requires repetition beyond immediate reward. Immediate reward weakens perseverance. Perseverance compounds quietly. You understand compounding because you have seen cycles unfold. You watched technology evolve gradually. You witnessed markets recover over years. You saw cultural shifts move in waves. That long-view awareness counterbalances digital urgency. Urgency screams. Long-term thinking whispers. The whisper, however, sustains. There is also a social cost to convenience. When communication is instant, depth can suffer. Quick exchanges replace long conversations. Reactions replace reflection. You remember conversations without interruption, meals without phones, shared silence without awkwardness. That memory allows you to recreate those spaces intentionally, to put devices away, to maintain eye contact, to listen fully. Listening is becoming rare. Rarity increases value. In professional and personal environments, the one who listens deeply stands out. The one who maintains focus stands out. The one who resists constant distraction builds trust. Trust is slow to build and fast to break. Convenience speeds interaction, but trust still requires time. You intuitively know this. Because trust, yes, in your youth, was built face-to-face. Over repeated presence, over consistent behavior. The digital youth was built face-to-face. Over repeated presence, over consistent behavior. The digital storm cannot accelerate that process. And so, in a world addicted to speed, your understanding of pace becomes strategic. You are not anti-progress. You are pro-depth. You are not anti-technology. You are pro-intentionality. The cost of convenience is invisible until attention collapses, until anxiety rises without clear cause, until depth feels unreachable. But you carry an antidote inside your history. You remember how to slow down. You remember how to focus on one thing at a time. You remember how to wait. Waiting is now a competitive advantage. Focus is now a differentiator. Intentional disconnection is now strength. The digital storm will not slow itself, but you can regulate your exposure. You can choose depth over noise, and you can choose presence over performance. You can choose friction when friction builds you. Convenience made life easier, but your analog memory makes you stronger. And strength, not ease, determines who remains steady when the next acceleration comes. Chapter 8. Adaptation as Identity. There is a difference between surviving change and being shaped by it. Some people experience transformation as disruption. You experienced it as environment. You did not grow up in stability and then encounter one major shift. You grew up inside continuous transition. Analog to digital, landlines to smartphones, encyclopedias to search engines, 9/11 to 2008, recession to recovery, pandemic to reinvention. Each phase demanded recalibration, and you recalibrated. Quietly. You did not call it resilience. You called it normal. But what feels normal is often the deepest training. Adaptation, repeated often enough, becomes identity. You no longer see change as anomaly. You see it as pattern. That distinction separates panic from strategy. When change feels abnormal, it triggers alarm. When change feels cyclical, it triggers assessment. You assess. You have historical memory inside your nervous system. You remember that industries collapse and rebuild, that technologies emerge and fade, that headlines exaggerate, that markets swing. This memory reduces fear. Fear narrows thinking. Reduced fear expands options. Adaptability is not the same as instability. Instability is chaotic movement without control. Adaptability is deliberate movement within chaos. You learned the difference early. When the internet arrived, you didn't reject it. You learned it. When 2008 struck, you didn't dissolve. You adjusted. When remote work became necessary, you recalibrated again. This pattern is not accidental. It is your defining trait. You're not defined by nostalgia. You're defined by transition tolerance. Tolerance of transition is one of the rarest psychological assets in unstable eras. Because most people crave permanence, they want guarantees, they want fixed ground. But you have already learned that ground shifts, and when ground shifts, the rigid crack first. Flexible systems survive. Flexibility, however, is often misunderstood. It is not weakness, it is structural intelligence. A building designed to sway slightly in wind stands longer than one designed to remain completely still. You sway, but you do not fall. There is also a deep emotional advantage in having survived multiple reinventions. You are less shocked by disruption. You are less surprised by acceleration. You are less destabilized by cultural change. Because you have experienced it repeatedly. Repeated exposure lowers novelty. Lower novelty lowers anxiety. Lower anxiety increases clarity. Clarity produces better decisions. In leadership, in parenting, in partnership, clarity is stabilizing. You are raising children in a world radically different from the one you knew. You are building careers in industries that may not exist in 10 years. You are navigating platforms that did not exist 20 years ago, and yet